Gonjiam Haunted Asylum is a 2018 South Korean found footage supernatural horror that's premise is bluntly stated in its title. It tells the story of a horror YouTuber called Haijun, who recruits a team to livestream the supposed scary happenings in the real-life former Gonjiam psychiatric hospital in Gwangju. However, the most striking mystery they seek to investigate is the elusive intensive care unit's room 402 that to this day has never been breached, effectively mythologizing it as a possible doorway to hell that's said to curse anyone who opens it with deathly consequences. Now, here's the thing, this is not an obscure recommendation from me, but rather one strongly requested by you, because this film was honestly only ever loosely on my radar for cynical reasons, being that so many people online had hyped it up as the scariest found footage film ever made, which is not a particularly healthy hyperbolic expectation going into any film for the first time, so I waited until the dust had settled and my expectations were more firmly in check, and oh my god, Jesus Christ, holy Satan sitting in shit. It is genuinely as scary as a lot of people say it is, at least speaking about its final act. While it hasn't cemented itself in my personal favourite found footage list, Gonjiam is a solidly uncomfortable back-to-basics ghost story that does so much with so little, especially when it comes to environmental storytelling, as it echoes much of the uncanny rawness I expressed when talking about Session 9's use of a real-world psychiatric hospital. I think what helps distinguish Gonjiam in particular is its use of a seemingly real-time livestream format to build up the necessary monotony and slow burn fly on the wall stillness needed to keep you fixated on every corner of the frame, looking for something to confirm your deepening unease. Obviously, as a byproduct of its format, there's no escaping the inevitable comparisons to the Blair Witch Project, yet I think a more suitable comparison is the narratively and structurally similar ghost hunting satires Grave Encounters and Ghostwatch, as the film becomes increasingly disorientating and otherworldly, as though the temporal logic of time and space seems to draw its characters into a dimension of its own. In fact, I know this will sound divisive, but it definitely shares more of its identity with the 2016 modernized reboot of Blair Witch, with the extensive use of drone shots and multicam that are used to brilliant effect to elicit many unexpected scares that I'll talk about later in the video. Now, taking the brief scenic route through the film's production, according to Korea Jongyang Daily, while the film was shot in a local high school in Busan, the filmmakers did painstakingly recreate the real Gonjiam building to ensure its worldly authenticity. In fact, the Korea Herald even reported that the film's production design was so true to life that the site's proprietor actually sued the production, believing it was detrimental to their efforts to sell the property, only for the courts to rule in the film's favour. That need to ground the film in a legitimate location is undeniably paramount to much of the setup, not only to get you hooked on its alleged superstitious history, but as keenly highlighted in an extensive interview with Film International, director and co-writer John Bom-shik explained his efforts to inject real tragic social and political context to add further tangibility to the film's world. While obviously the use of social media as a framing device speaks for itself, Bom-shik laments that it's the emphasis placed on the hospital's history within the 1970s authoritarian Yoshin period that informs much of the later harrowing visuals. It gets a bit murky here, but in his own words, Bom-shik essentially evokes elements of torture, suppression, and negligence to lean into the unjust agony of the restless spirits, such as the Seoul ferry tragedy that occurred 4 years prior to production, that subtly frames the film as a possible symbolic gesture to prior political regimes. The Seoul incident he references is particularly noteworthy because it led to the death of 304 people, most of which being high schoolers, that, according to The Diplomat, basically helped in triggering South Korea's first presidential impeachment impeachment and direct imprisonment following years of corrupt practices until she was pardoned in 2021. Now, I'm just giving the cliff notes based on a few cited Google searches and Wikipedia because it is a complex rabbit hole I am not equipped to talk about, but purely for the purposes of the film, in my perspective, it seems to broadly serve in thematically reinforcing this intensely macabre, angry, and traumatically grief-stricken aura that Bombshik is aiming to achieve with the scares, particularly how it loosely ties into the setup of the hospital's ghoulish history. Simply put, none of this is required reading to engage with the story, but it does help inform the bleak emotional gravitas that surrounds this seemingly forbidden and taboo subject matter. In fact, knowing this actually makes the scene when the group find a photo of the former South Korean president more impactful, given the very acute tension it seems to trigger amongst them. Anyway, the film brilliantly sets up its mayhem with an obnoxiously portrait-framed vlog involving two teenagers attempting to break into room 402 only to go missing after seemingly encountering something dangerous lurking in the abyss. Ha-jun explains that the hospital closed in 1979 after the patients committed mass suicide and the institution's director went missing, with some sources even claiming it was a murder-suicide perpetrated by the director, who in turn represents the corrupt political influence Bombshik is inferring to in his interview. More so, to really cement that wicked history, Ha-jun notes that the hospital also housed political prisoners and violent criminals, and was even vaguely rumoured to be built on land where the Japanese brutally murdered the Korean resistance in secret, while others even suspect that the hospital is nothing more than a front for a national torturing facility. Regardless of the real-world truths, it nonetheless casts a very brooding shadow over what is ultimately a haunted asylum that's never fully explained, besides branding it as bad with a capital B, as its legend only continues to ferment indefinitely as tourists and urban explorers disturb upon the wailing cries of the restless spirits. Now, inferring back to what I said earlier about the characters finding a picture of the former South Korean president, I feel what greatly solidifies the aura is the shifting demeanors of the characters, as the energy, adrenaline, and palpable enthusiasm they have going in begins to notably diminish the more they come to realize just how awful and tragic the history is. What I find elevates much of the early parts of the film before the real horror begins is how distinctly humanized and sympathetic the characters are, as it plants us warmly in their shoes as they basically get into character for what is practically a performance drama to make the live stream engaging, only for those raw primordial emotions to seep through when shit truly hits the fan. Notably, you could argue there is a pretty strong meta element to how the character of Ha-jun embodies the actual director Bombshik by literally directing the livestream towards the climax of room 402. Thus, the film follows a pretty explicit script in the first half that inevitably goes tits up when the real horror that's uncontrollable takes over. In other words, the film is self-aware in establishing this sort of artificial illusion of a spooky house of jump scares that is meant to feel predictable, if indeed still effective, only for it to eventually reveal Ha-jun and his team are embellishing many of the scares in a bid to rack up the view count, after which the real horror becomes incredibly unpredictable and abstract, as if to mock all that vapid ghost hunting bollocks to show them what the real McCoy looks like. I will admit I have definitely described some films like this before, grave counters in fact, but the way I see it, it does add a fun flair to the inherent comeuppance that Ha-jun is destined to face for effectively exploiting tragedy for commercial entertainment, as they say. At the end of the day, it is your classical morality play where there needs to be somewhat of a thematic antagonist that's ultimately lesser to the real evil that's represented by the murderous spirit of the Asylum director, who's given the distinct trait of being a skilled ping pong player a la Marty Supreme, and thus her arrival is supposedly signaled by the bouncing of a ping pong ball. On a technical level, there are subtle touches like the irregular glitching of the livestream that perpetually keep you on edge, but for me, it's the editing contrasting between wide liminal shots of elongated empty rooms and corridors and claustrophobic face cams that really do cement much of the horror. I will call myself out here because I have smugly criticized some found footage films in the past for having too many angles, to the point it feels like it's cheating its way out of being a cinematic film, but I loved the relentlessness of it, because in many ways it stops you from becoming too accustomed to the inherent banality of the setting. Put it this way, on the one hand, the face cams disempower you by enforcing a sense of oppressive intimacy and making you unable to see your surroundings, while on the other hand, wide shots exploit your hyperfixation on searching for the scare after you are conditioned to anticipate something lurking just out of sight when triggered by the explicit freeze frame shown in the opening. Obviously, me telling you the scares is like explaining a joke. It's an injustice to the visceral nature of how they're constructed, but it cleverly sows seeds to manipulate you into a way of thinking before pulling the rug from under you, as it were. To give you an idea of the ingenuity required to craft a good scare, this scene sees a spirit posed provocatively and evidently staged in such a way that you know it will most likely eventually run at the character, yet after building up the silence, it subverts that expectation by suddenly confronting the character with a different spirit entirely before it disappears. However, once the dust has settled, you are left completely disarmed from that previous setup that the film can then throw that expected scare at you in a place that you now least expect. I mean, it's basically a really prolonged flinch. It's also worth noting at this point that the film does introduce an element of abstractness given how the characters are revealed to be in an otherworldly dimension of sorts, thus all conventional logic goes out the window, leaving you vulnerable to potentially anything. I like to think of myself as a bit of a veteran with these films who can usually see the scare coming in some capacity, but I admire how patient the film is to just leave you lingering in the silence and then keep you on that razor sharp edge of will they, won't they scare you. Thus, the final act sees the characters getting separated and attacked in different ways, ending up in room 402, to which this brilliantly sneaky hand scare sees the rest of them become seemingly possessed. Once Haijun hits his goal of getting 1 million views, he goes in search for the rest of the team only to be confronted by this brooding nightmare reveal reminiscent of the end of Wreck. However, what profoundly solidifies the ending and seals the tragedy of it all is the cheeky cherry on top that adds insult to injury when it's revealed that the stream actually cut out far earlier than Haijun believed and reached just over 500 views, thus treating their disappearance as just another part of a messy history to be brushed under the rug and forgotten. Well, that said, not to shit on this film's inconsequential point, but if this is 500 concurrent views, that's actually a really fucking decent number for a stream. Sure, the comments mock it as fake news to further hammer home the dire fate of the characters, but YouTuber to YouTuber, you can't scoff at that kind of engagement.